I've written this book because I'm convinced the American church is at an impossibly and almost unbearably important inflection point. The parallels to where the German church was in the 1930s are unavoidable and grim. So the only question, and what concerns us in this slim volume, is whether we might understand those parallels and thereby avoid the fatal mistakes the German church made during that time and their superlatively catastrophic results. If we do not, I am convinced we will reap a whirlwind greater even than the one they did. The German church of the 1930s was silent in the face of evil. But can there be any question whether the American church of our own time is guilty of the same silence? Because of this, I am compelled to speak out and to say what only by God's grace I might say to make plain where we find ourselves at this moment at our own unavoidably crucial crossroads in history. It is for good or for ill that America plays an inescapably central role in the world. If you've not read Alexis de Tocqueville on this subject, you likely nonetheless understand that the extent to which that central role has been used for good and for God's purposes has had everything to do with our churches, or with the American church, as we may call her. So if America is in any way exceptional, it has nothing to do with the blood that runs through American veins, and everything to do with the blood shed for us on Calvary, and to the extent that we have acknowledged this. America has led the world in making religious liberty paramount, knowing that it is only with a deep regard for it that we may speak of liberty at all. It was this that made de Tocqueville marvel most, that while in other nations, and especially in his own nation of France, the church was adamantly opposed to the idea of political liberty. In America, it was the churches that helped encourage, create, and sustain a culture of liberty. Because of the outsized role America plays in the world today, the importance of whether we learn the lesson of what happened to the German church 90 years ago cannot be overstated. Though it may be a gruesome thing to consider, the monstrous evil that befell the civilized world precisely because of the German church's failure is likely a mere foretaste of what will befall the world if the American church fails in a similar way at this hour. And at present, we are indeed failing. We should underscore the idea that the centrality of our nation in the world does not mean that we are intrinsically exceptional, but rather that God has sovereignly chosen us to hold the torch of liberty for all the world, and that the church is central to our doing this. So the idea that he has charged us with this most solemn duty should make us tremble. Nonetheless, we must carry out that duty in a way that is the opposite of prideful, and that is meant to be an invitation to all beyond our shores. If we should aspire, in the words of Jesus, as quoted by John Winthrop, to be a shining city on a hill, the idea is that we should exist and shine for the sake of others and not for ourselves alone. President Abraham Lincoln said that we in America were God's almost chosen people, and acknowledged that this placed upon us an almost unbearable burden. It is a certainty from the Scriptures and from our experience over the centuries that apart from God, we can do nothing. So if God has chosen us for some task, we must do all we can to shoulder that task and must know more than anything that unless we lean on Him and acknowledge Him in all our ways, we are guaranteed to fail. We must also remind ourselves that when God chooses anyone, whether the nation of Israel or a single person, to perform any role or any task, it is never something to be celebrated as though the one chosen has won a contest. Quite to the contrary, it is a grave and fearsome responsibility. So, if the Lord has chosen America and the American church to stand against the evils and deceptions of this present darkness, we had better be sure we understand what is required of us and had better make sure we do all that is possible to fulfill our charge. Throughout this book, I will touch on some of the issues we are facing, but let us here say that it is something almost unprecedented. The emergence of ideas and forces that ultimately are at war with God Himself. It's easy to see this with regard to Germany in the 1930s, when we think of the death camps and the murder of so many millions. But we need to understand that in the beginning, they had no idea where it was leading and had no idea they were facing nothing less than the forces of Antichrist. We are now facing those same forces in different guises. But the extent of it is even worse than it was 90 years ago, because those forces do not have an agenda that is hyper-nationalistic, as in Germany, but that is actually anti-nationalist, which is to say that it is globalist. These ideas seem to have emerged lately, but they've been growing quietly in our midst, and we have not taken them seriously enough. Many have been fooled into thinking them essentially harmless. We are today like the proverbial frog in the saucepan, simmering along and never realizing that unless we see our situation and leap out now, we are very soon to be cooked and beyond all leaping. The ideas and forces we face have an atheistic Marxist ideology in common, although it never declares itself as such. It knows that doing this would wake many people up who are still asleep, and that would ruin everything. But what we must dare to see is that these many ideas share a bitter taproot that leads all the way down to hell. Critical race theory, which is atheistic and Marxist, and radical transgender and pro-abortion ideologies are all inescapably anti-God and anti-human. So they are dedicatedly at war with the ideas of family and marriage, and with the idea of America as a force for good, as a force for spreading the gospel and gospel values throughout the world. These ideas have, over many decades, infiltrated our own culture in such a way that they touch everything. And part of what makes them so wicked is that they smilingly pretend to share the biblical values that champion the underdog against the oppressor. As Stalin and Hitler and Mao would butcher millions in the name of fighting for the people, so these forces do the same and are angling to do much, much more of the same if we will allow them the time to strengthen themselves. if we do not fight with all our might and main against them right now. One of the principal ways in which they have gained strength is in persuading so many in the American church that to fight them is to abandon the gospel for pure culture warring or for politics. This is not just nonsense, but is a supremely deceptive and satanic lie, designed only to silence those who would genuinely speak for truth. So those who behave as though there's really nothing to worry about, who seem to think, as such prominent pastors as Andy Stanley and others do, that we ought to assiduously avoid fighting these threats and be apolitical, are tragically mistaken, are burying their heads in the sand and exhorting others to do the same. Or to put it another way, they are in their churches singing more and more loudly to drown out the cries of those in the boxcars heading to their gruesome deaths. Sing with us, they say, and don't worry about all of those other issues out there. They don't concern us. Our job is to focus on God and to pretend that we can do so without fighting for those He loves, whose lives and futures are being destroyed. So to restate our situation, this is not a task or duty we in the American church have asked for. Nonetheless, just as the German church had a painfully important task and did not rise to that occasion to perform it, so we have a painfully important task, whether we have asked for it or not. God calls us to do something, but the choice whether we do it is entirely ours. Because we are made in God's image, we are perfectly free and therefore cannot be compelled to do what is right. It is a chilling prospect, especially in light of the failure of the German church. If anyone would feel that believing God has chosen the American church for such a vital role somehow smacks of an egotistical nationalism, they have already bought into the Marxist and globalist lie that America is nothing special or is probably a force for evil at this point. In any case, they miss the point and have only leapt away from one ditch to fall headlong into another. It is a fact that God in His sovereignty chose the German church to stand against the evils of its day, but it shrank from acknowledging this and from standing. Germany has been living with the deep shame over it unto this day. So for the American church to say that God has not chosen us is as bad as saying He must choose us because we deserve to be chosen. Both stances are equally guilty of the sin of pride. It is far easier to ignore God's call than to acknowledge it and rise to fulfill it. But it is more difficult and painful than anything to live with the results of ignoring God's call. Let the reader understand.